All right. So today we are going to end our look at the Crusading era by looking at the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth Crusades in one sitting. Um, this doesn't. I called it the end of the Crusading era. It's not really the end of the Crusading era because Crusades are going to continue time on and time off throughout history, and even in between the numbered crusades, which are sort of the official crusades, there were independent crusades, crusades of certain nationalities or whatever, going in between these groups to the Holy Land. So the six crusades are this kind of the six main crusades, uh, but the crusading, but at the end of the sixth crusade, we just kind of stop counting because they become just insignificant. And it's at the end of the sixth crusade is roughly 50 years before the Holy Land is wiped out of crusaders. So this is really sort of properly titled, I think, the end of the crusading era. But crusading itself is a notion that stays in Europe and stays in the Western mindset even up until the present day. When you go back to when they were talking about, for example, the war in Iraq was referred to by some commentators as a holy war or a crusade, which is silly and stupid, but nonetheless it was. That's the American media for you. So the Fourth Crusade is going to be the last crusade we look at in any depth. And it has its origins in the failures of the Third Crusade, much as the Third Crusade had its origins in the failures of the Second Crusade, and the Second Crusade had its origins in the fall of Edessa, which was a consequence of the after effects of the First Crusade. So the Fourth Crusade is launched due to Richard the Lionheart's failure to capture Jerusalem, and that failure, which so many commentators at the time felt was so close, but just missed it by that much. Europe will continue to seek opportunities to take Jerusalem, and calling the Fourth Crusade is one of these opportunities. Um, the papacy, in particular, is very much the driver of these things. It's the Pope's stamp of approval that gives these things the holy patina, if you will, under which they go. It gives it that luster of the church or being led by the church. And so the Pope will give his approval to this Fourth Crusade as well as they have to all the other crusades. Now, crusading at this time is starting to lose its appeal. It hasn't lost its appeal. It's starting to lose its appeal. It's getting kind of old. We're now in the 1200s. We are close to being 200, or we're about, well, a little over 100 years after the Crusades first started. And 100 years to keep a movement going is quite impressive, I have to say. But there's rarely any movements that kind of continue on for more than a century. So kudos to them for keeping it going, I suppose. In 1198, a guy named Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages, he issues a new bull called Post Miserabile. And this bull basically sets out that starting a new crusade to the Holy Land is going to be an important part of his papacy. This is an important policy objective that he intends to achieve. This is kind of like popes issue these things, sort of like political candidates issue manifestos or platforms. This is what I'm going to do as pope, or this is what I intend to do as pope. But despite Innocent's call, again, no one really responds, and we see this problem with the Third Crusade as well, and with the Second Crusade. It takes a while for these things to kind of catch on. And one of the reasons why people are ignoring Innocent's call is because the papacy and the Germans are now in conflict, and England and France are at war. So the temporary truces and the peaces that existed to allow the Third Crusade to launch are not existing at this time. The geopolitical situation in Europe has been altered, and so it's a very slow response to the papal call. In the Holy Land, meanwhile, the kingdom of Jerusalem, which Richard had restored in the Third Crusade, is not as big as it had been after the First Crusade. You remember we talked about this last time, but it controls prime coastal territory. It's basically a coastal kingdom. And there's a new king, Henry II, and he has set about attempting to secure this realm that Richard has managed to win for them. And he signs treaties of truce with the new Egyptian sultan, a guy named Alexis Utman. And he also maintains the peace treaty signed at Jaffa between Richard and Saladin. So what he's trying to do is to use diplomatic means to secure his throne. And this is something that previous kings of Jerusalem have done to some success, not always successful, but to some success. I mean, this is one of the reasons why they lasted so long, is taking advantage of the political situation in the area at the time. But in 1197, there's a group of Germans who lead a crusade to the Holy Land, and they attack Damascus. And this is violating the peace that Henry has established between the Muslims and the Christians in that area. Al-Adil, the ruler of Damascus, is also Saladin's brother, and he responds to this breaking of the truce by seizing the port city of Jaffa. And Henry II decides that he's going to attempt to relieve the city, but he dies before being able to attempt this, and Jaffa remained in Muslim hands. Now, the Germans, however, managed to secure Beirut for the kingdom. So while they lose Jaffa, they gain Beirut. Henry II's successor, a guy named Amory, negotiates a new treaty with Al-Adil to basically maintain the status quo. All right, you have Jaffa, we have Beirut. Let's just agree to keep it like this going forward. And so they do. This limits the damage of war. This is not an ongoing war. Now, this gives Al-Adil time to reconsolidate Saladin's empire under his control, because it had fractured very badly when Saladin died. Saladin's sons are arguing over the succession. Succession in the Muslim world is not as easy as in the Christian world. In the Christian world, the primary way one king succeeds another is called primogeniture. The firstborn succeeds the father. And it's generally male preference primogeniture, where the first son succeeds the father. Now, in the Muslim world, it is a little bit different. In the Muslim world, if you're the first son if your father is the king and you're the first son, there is no guarantee that you are the crown prince or that you will succeed. In fact, it is common for the king's brother to succeed, and then for his brother to succeed, and then for his brother to succeed, down the line of that generation until that generation is gone. And then it moves down to the next generation, where you have brothers succeeding brothers. This is how, in Saudi Arabia, for example, the succession has happened since the foundation of that nation. You have had brothers succeeding, or younger brothers succeeding older brothers. It doesn't move generation to generation. And that is why, when you look at Saudi Arabia, the kings are always so old. If you're always asking yourself, when this king died, he died when he was like 90, and then his brother succeeded, and his brother is like 80, and then his brother succeeded, and he's 72. Why are these guys so old? Well, it's because it's brothers succeeding brothers. Now, in the Muslim world, it is common for kings to change the succession, and they can change it however they want. So, for example, in Jordan, which is a kingdom, King Hussein, who was the previous king, was originally going to be succeeded by his brother. Until just before he died, about 2 years before he died, he named his son Abdullah to be his successor. This is a break in tradition. And so that is why King Abdullah is the king of Jordan now. And King Abdullah was his crown prince, the guy who was going to succeed him, was his brother until he changed it for his son just a few years ago. So in the Muslim world, succession is not as easy as in the Christian world. In the Christian world, once dad dies, the firstborn has a really good claim to the throne. In the Muslim world, once dad dies, not so much. Sometimes you got to battle it out. And in the case of Saladin's empire, when he died, it fractured, and the sons argued over who should succeed. Because remember, Al-Adil, as the brother of Saladin, has a claim to this throne too, and it's equally as good or even better under the way that Muslim customs worked at the time. So that's sort of what's going on. The Holy Land, there's politics going on in the Holy Land that the Kingdom of Jerusalem is kind of exploiting to maintain itself and to keep itself at peace. Now let's look at the state of Byzantium. We haven't really looked at the state of Byzantium. in the last crusade or in the crusade before that. But Constantinople, despite this being relatively late in the imperial time, remember Constantinople was founded in the 300s by Constantine. By this time, Constantinople is the greatest of the glittering cities of the Western world. I think it still has the right to maintain that status, even in the Middle Ages, even though the empire is much, much reduced. It is alone among the great centers of the Western world in that it had still functioning aqueducts, fountains, baths, large forums and marketplaces, palaces, sewers, monuments, and all manner of civic infrastructure that would have been established by the Romans, and that was common in Roman cities. These things still existed and were maintained by the Byzantines in Constantinople. Compare this to what we know about medieval London, which is basically a cattle town of dirt streets. It's really muddy. There's not good sanitation. The water is foul. It's a place that the rich try and escape from. Same thing with Paris. Byzantium is different. Byzantium is really a jewel. And even though it was in reduced circumstances, it was head and shoulders above any of the centers of Western Europe. So politically, however, the empire at this time is very fractious. They're having political infighting too. The throne is being fought over by two men who are barely competent to hold a toothbrush. These guys are real idiots. And these guys who are fighting are Isaac II Angelus, if you remember him from the Third Crusade. This is the guy who gave the Germans all those problems when they tried to cross the Byzantine Empire. It's this guy. It's Isaac II. And he is fighting with his brother Alexius III Angelus. And Isaac and Alexius are brothers. And the same, so if we're looking at the throne of Byzantium, the throne of Byzantium is really a fluid thing. Again, the firstborn son does not always have the right to succeed. The emperor has the sole right to determine who his successor is. So when he dies and he's not around to enforce his decision, it can get really hairy. And that's kind of the situation here. Isaac is pretty incompetent. His actions almost come to the point of forcing Frederick Barbarossa during the Third Crusade to besiege Constantinople. He sells state offices like they're water. He sells state resources, and he essentially outsources responsibility for naval defense to the Venetian Navy. So he's outsourcing everything because he doesn't want to raise it, doesn't have the trouble of raising it. You just pay for it and you get someone else to do it. Now this is a problem because the Byzantines traditionally are known for their navy. The Byzantine Navy is traditionally the great power in the Eastern Mediterranean, but as time goes on, it really starts falling off. And under Isaac, it really starts plummeting. He is a lavish spender. He really likes his luxuries. He likes the trappings of monarchy. And he took very careful care to ensure that his treasury was nearly always empty. He gives gifts to favorites, and he basically neglects his first job, which is defense of the empire. So he's overthrown in a palace coup by his brother Alexius III. And as you do in the Byzantine system, when you overthrow the previous emperor, you blind him and you exile him. The Byzantines did not, generally speaking, execute the previous emperor, although some certainly did. What they did is blinded him, which was a penalty for treason. And blinding was considered to be worse than execution because you lost your vision and your ability to essentially be mobile. You essentially became useless in their eyes. And so blinding was a common punishment for serious crimes in the Byzantine Empire. But Alexius is no better than his brother. He's pretty incompetent too. His naval commander, the guy he appoints over what's remaining of the Byzantine Navy, is said to have sold the ships of the fleet down to the individual nail, just to line his own pockets. He made very bad deals with mercenaries and the semi-autonomous generals on the frontier, who you need to keep in line and you need to keep them on your side in order to protect your empire. And then so this basically destabilizes the empire's border regions. So if we look at Europe, Europe is kind of fighting against each other, and then we have the Muslim world, which is kind of in a fight with each other over succession to Saladin's big empire. And then we have the Byzantine world, fractious and fractured between these two brothers who are fighting. So the Fourth Crusade is launched into this atmosphere. And the objective of the crusade is to capture Jerusalem. That's not a surprise. That is the common objective of all crusades, is to capture Jerusalem. The Pope decided that the strategy that had been endorsed by Richard I during the Third Crusade was the strategy that should be employed during the Fourth Crusade. And namely, this was, instead of going for a direct assault at Jerusalem, we should instead go and take Egypt, which is sort of the breadbasket powerhouse of Saladin's empire. And once we knock that out, once we capture Egypt, it's going to severely weaken the Muslims who are holding Jerusalem and the surrounding area, and it'll be much easier for us to take it. So the assembling of the crusade was very difficult due to the political problems in Europe. No one is immediately flocking to this papal flag, the crusading flag. All the indulgences and the promises of the church and the protections of the church aren't really doing it this time. Those are kind of losing their luster. And so finally a guy named Count Thibaut of Champagne agrees to lead it, but he dies in 1201. And he is replaced by a guy named Boniface of Montferrat. Now, you might be asking, who is Boniface of Montferrat? Well, if you remember, in the First Crusade, there's a guy named Conrad of Montferrat. Or in the Third Crusade, there's a guy named Conrad of Montferrat, who was going to be the king of Jerusalem and who Richard I allegedly had murdered. This is his brother, Boniface. So the primary objective of this crusade is Egypt. This is where they're going first. And the crusade is going to be a maritime campaign. It's not going to be an overland campaign. They're going to sail to Egypt and take it and then go up to Jerusalem, which is a relatively short march, actually. So in order to do this, you need a lot of sea transport. And the only countries that have significant amounts of ships that have an expertise in moving large amounts of things very quickly on the sea are the Italian city-states, most notably Genoa and Venice. And Genoa and Venice are known for their very large military and merchant fleets. These guys are experts at being seaborne, as you would expect for a city, particularly like Venice. Genoa is not interested. Genoa is on the west side of Italy. Venice is on the east side, at the part where the boot kind of comes up. They're rivals. Genoa is not interested, but Venice is. Venice is a great merchant republic at this time. It is a very powerful state. It has been known through its illustrious history as the most serene Republic of Venice. La Serenissima. You could say La Serenissima in the Middle Ages and everybody would know you were talking about Venice. And Venice said, okay, we will build you a fleet to transport up to 33,500 crusaders to Egypt. Now, to do this, the city has to invest substantial resources in shipbuilding, and in order to get the resources, they have to reduce their own economic activity, their own economic commercial activities. They need to devote a lot of the wood and the iron and the gold that they have and the silver that they have on hand to basically build this fleet on spec for the Crusaders. Now, the city is known for its ability to build ships. Venice is, you could say notorious, but it's actually fairly enterprising. It has a very secretive naval dockyard. It's called the Arsenal. The Arsenal is like the nuclear bomb of the day. Its methods were a highly guarded state secret. And the Arsenal was so efficient at producing warships that it could produce at the rate of one per day. So when Venice was in battle with another seaborne power, if it lost ships, it could produce another one the next day. How long do you think it would take an opponent to do that? It's going to take them a lot longer. But Venice is using a rudimentary form, I wouldn't call it rudimentary, a very efficient form of mass production and of line assembly. And this is working very, very well for them. And so they produced 50 warships and 450 transports in this period for the Crusade. This is in a period of about a year. So they're producing more than one ship per day. That's quite something. That's a big, big commercial effort, industrial effort in the Middle Ages at this time, even for a city like Venice. They really put their all in this. Now, the Venetians don't intend to do this for free. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They haven't been successful because they do things or they just give things away. They intend to be paid. And they demand an upfront payment of 85,000 silver marks in return for the ships. That's a lot of money. But the crusading army that arrives in Venice is smaller than anticipated. And they only had about 35,000 silver marks between them. And they managed to raise another 14,000 as time went on. So in all, they've raised about 49,000 marks, which is quite a bit shy of the goal. So for the Venetians, who have sacrificed a great deal of time and treasure putting together this fleet, this is a major problem. Because in addition to building the fleet, they also have to man it. And to man it, it would take between 15,000 and 20,000 men. And this is a massive amount of their population. It's even said to be roughly half of the male population of Venice would have been required for this fleet. So this is a major issue for them. So the majority of Crusaders are French, and there are contingencies from all over Europe, but the army that embarked at Venice was primarily French, and it numbered about 12,000 men. Now, the Doge of Venice, was a guy named Enrico Dandolo. Now, the Doge, just so that you're familiar, the Doge is an office that essentially means duke. Doge means duke in the Venetian dialect of Italian, and the Doge is an aristocratic leader elected for life to serve as the chief executive of Venice. Doges, as time goes on, as the Republic goes on, they essentially become prisoners of their own palace. They become more symbols than anything, to the point that when Napoleon dissolves the Venetian Republic in the 1790s, the Doge of Venice is essentially a non-entity. But at this time, the Doge is really quite powerful. Now, he has a foreign army in his city, on his land, and he has a brand new fleet of brand new ships, many of which we now find are surplus because the army that's arrived is simply smaller than what they were told to expect. And he's not been paid for them properly. So the Venetians have to decide, what do we do with this? Do we send these crusaders home, accept the loss, and despite the damage to our economy, or is there another solution that's staring us in the face? The Venetians, being good businessmen, decide that the crusaders could work off their debt by helping them pacify some territories along the Adriatic coastline. Venice is not just the city. When we think of Venice, we think of the city of Venice. But Venice traditionally governed not just Venice, the city, that famous city. It governed the Veneto, which is the region on the mainland around the city, and also had significant influence on the Adriatic coast, down the coastlines of modern Croatia and Bosnia. So it had trading ports and islands that it controlled, even into Greece and up to Constantinople. It was a very big trading empire. And Venice, like all empires do, it has issues with getting compliance from its subject cities sometimes. So the target, or one of the targets that the Venetians had, they wanted to bring back into their orbit, was the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. And this city had recently thrown off the Venetian yoke and had allied with the King of Hungary. And Dandolo decides that he has now a foreign army that's indebted to him, which relies entirely on his ships to get where they want to go. And so he decides he's going to use them to settle Venice's scores all along the way to Egypt, of course. We'll eventually get there. So the Venetians take the Crusader army and they use it to intimidate small coastal ports and cities in the Adriatic. And in particular, they attack Zara, which is a Christian city. Now, Crusades are not supposed to attack other Christians. This is a bad thing. And when the Pope hears about the sack of Zara, he is incensed, and he excommunicates the entire crusade, every single one of them, all the leaders and all the soldiers. But the leaders of the crusade, including the priests and the bishops who were in the crusade, decide that this information would be so disheartening to their men, they hold it back. They don't tell their men that they've been excommunicated. And in this way, they really co-opt the Pope's authority over this crusade. It starts off as a papal endeavor, but the Pope very quickly loses control. The army then winters in Zara, and then the Crusaders then the Venetians decide that they would like the Crusaders to help them settle scores with another commercial rival, which is Constantinople. Um, so the political machinations are a little bit complicated, so try and keep it in your head, but we're going to try and go through them. So Venice and the Byzantines have a long-standing rivalry. If you look at Venice, if you ever go to Venice and you look at the architecture, you will see a very heavy Eastern influence. Venetian architecture is very influenced by the same type of architecture that's in Constantinople, because Constantinople used to control Venice. Venice became independent, and then they became rivals. And if you go to the Church of St. Mark, or the Cathedral, St. Mark's Basilica rather, in Venice, you'll see it's a very Byzantine building, as opposed to cathedrals in other parts of Europe. So there's a long-standing rivalry between the Byzantines and Venice. So a Byzantine prince, a guy named Alexius IV Angelus, who is the son of Isaac II, is looking for help taking the throne back from Alexius III, who's his uncle and who's the reigning emperor. So remember, Alexius has deposed Isaac, and now Isaac's son, Alexius, is coming to the Crusaders and saying, look, I need your help to overthrow the guy who overthrew my dad. Alexius IV, he meets with the Venetians and he meets with the Crusaders and their leadership, and he promises that if they help him, he would pay the entire debt that the Crusaders owed to the Venetians. He would also offer an additional 100,000 silver marks to the Crusaders, and he would offer 10,000 Byzantine troops for the crusade, and he would pay perpetually to maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land. And he would submit the Eastern Church to the Pope in Rome. Well, that's a really good deal. And you know what we say about deals that are too good to be true is that they probably are. So Dandolo is very much in favor of this plan, but he's crafty. Dandolo is the former ambassador of Venice to Constantinople. He knows that the city, that the empire, cannot afford this deal. They cannot, even if the Crusaders are successful in getting Constantinople, he knows that Alexius cannot pay what he's offering. He knows that. But he says, yes, we'll take the deal. Why not? So Dandolo, by the way, is blind, and he was blinded by the Byzantines. So that's another reason why he hates them so much, is that they blinded him. So Dandolo decides that he's going to cajole and bribe the Crusader leadership to go along with this idea. But some refuse, and they go on to Syria. They leave the expedition at this point. They don't want anything to do with attacking Constantinople. So just as an aside, this is what Constantinople kind of looks like traditionally in the ancient and medieval period. So it's a city on a peninsula. It's surrounded by a great wall. The landward-facing wall is a triple wall. It's 3 walls deep. There's a sea wall that surrounds it. On the right-hand side, you'll see a little line that stretches across the Golden Horn, and that line is a chain, and that chain prevents ships from going around the city to land troops on the landward side of the city. So it's a very strategic thing, and it saves the city several times when it's under siege. The Cathedral of Hagia Sophia is in the south end of the city as we're looking at it, and there's the great Hippodrome and other great squares, but this is essentially what Constantinople looks like. It's a pretty strategic place. So the Crusaders and the Venetian Navy, they placed the city under siege in about 1203 in July. And they were successful in breaking through the Great Chain that protected the Golden Horn. And they did this by attacking its anchor point in the area across the on the other side of the Golden Horn. So you'll see there's a little fortified area across the Golden Horn. That's called Galatia or Galata or Galatia. It's not the Galatians of the Bible. It's a different place, but it's called Galatia. And they attack the anchor point of the chain, and they allow the chain to just fall into the water, and they later take parts of it away as souvenirs. And this allows them to sail ships up and down the Golden Horn and to get to land troops on the other side of the city. Now, they attempt to create an uprising because Alexius IV has said, look, my father is very popular, and so am I, and the citizens really, really like me. And so the Venetians put him on their ships, and they sail him along the city walls, and they display him to all the people. But the people mock him. They don't like him. They don't respect him. They think he's a dolt. And so the Venetians are a little bit miffed about this. Now, the emperor, Alexius III, who is Alexius IV's uncle, Isaac's brother, he attempts an offensive. So he attempts to take an offensive outside the city and to attack the Crusaders. Now, he has a pretty good number of troops. I think it's around 10,000. But as he gets outside the city walls, he panics and he flees, so he doesn't even attempt the attack. This guy is a real piece of work. And the city citizens, the leading citizens of the city, come together and they decide, well, he left, he ran off, he's no longer the emperor. They depose him, and they bring Isaac II back, and they restore him to the throne. Now, the whole point of the Crusader attack on Constantinople is to restore Isaac to the throne with his son Alexius as co-emperor. And they managed to do this. It's mission done. They don't even need to besiege the city. They don't need to attack it at all. And it's a bit of a letdown for them, really, but nonetheless, here they are. So at Alexius IV, he becomes co-emperor with his father, and he attempts to make good on his payment plan. But Alexius III had managed to take a substantial portion of the treasury with him, and that amounted to about half a ton of gold when he fled. And so basically the new emperor is strapped for cash. He cobbles together about 100,000 silver marks, and then he starts to melt down gold and silver icons and relics to make up the rest. And this, of course, makes him extremely unpopular for the very pious citizens of Constantinople. Alexius IV then attempts to attack Alexius III, the deposed emperor, away from the city, and while he is gone, riots break out in the city. The people don't like this new regime. They don't like the fact that the Crusaders seem to be pulling the emperor's strings, and so they riot. And there's a lot of Catholics who are killed in this event. The Crusaders and the Venetians then start a fire in the city, which burns for 3 days, and it destroys a huge part of the city and makes about 20% of the people, or about 100,000, or 20% of the population, or about 100,000 people homeless. Isaac dies in January of 1204, and the Byzantine Senate elects a new emperor and deposes Alexius IV. So they've kicked Alexius IV out now. And the new emperor was a guy named Alexius V. Alexius V is not related to the Angelids. He's not part of that family. So they've kind of thrown that whole family out. And Alexius V is successful in that he is able to capture and imprison Alexius IV, and instead of blinding him, he just has him strangled to get him out of the way. Now, the Crusaders insist that Alexius V honors his predecessor's promises to them, but he refuses. And despite Pope Innocent's orders that Constantinople was not to be attacked again, the clergy suppress the Pope's order, and they allow the Crusaders to then go ahead and to attack the city to get repayment of this debt. And in fact, they even preach war to the Crusaders. So they are really, really off. They're really, really off the trail here. The Crusaders attack the city. They loot about 900,000 silver marks from the city, which is an astronomical amount of money. And they basically despoiled churches, monasteries, palaces, and even many private homes. Many regular people lost everything. They killed thousands. And the Venetians very famously stole many of the imperial treasures and carried them off to Venice, where you can still see them to this day. These treasures still exist in Venice. If you go to St. Mark's Basilica and you go to see the treasury, many of those Byzantine artifacts are in fact there. So you can actually get a glimpse of how wealthy Byzantium was at its height, or even, not even at its height, on its downfall, which was still pretty interesting. So the Crusaders would establish what was called the Latin Empire in Constantinople. And this is an empire ruled by a Catholic, with the church subordinated to the Pope in Rome. And they appoint as the first emperor a guy named Baldwin of Flanders, Baldwin being a popular name for rulers, I suppose. And the Latin Empire would last from 1204 to 1261. And the sack of Constantinople is really something that should tear at your heart, because it really weakened Byzantium and the empire, and the city would never recover from this. If you read the accounts of Europeans who traveled to Constantinople in the Latin Empire, the city is so reduced from what it was even before. It is such a pale imitation of its former self. The great Hippodrome, where there were so many public events, and it was the great meeting place of the people, where the people met the emperor and they watched chariot races, it falls apart. It's completely neglected, as is much of the infrastructure of the city. So it is a catastrophe from a historical point. Just like when we go there, so much of the Byzantine architecture and the Byzantine monuments are not there anymore. which wouldn't have been the case if they had just left things as they were. And the weakness that this causes in Constantinople will lead 150 years later to its fall under to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. If the city had not been ransacked the way it was, there's a good chance that it would have been able to hold out as a bastion of a Christian bastion on the Bosporus to prevent Muslim armies from coming into Europe as early as they otherwise would have. So it's really a devastating thing for Christianity later on down the road. This is when you don't think about the long game. Sometimes you have to think about the long game, but that wasn't the case here. So the empire in the Latin period, it falls apart into different kingdoms, and these kingdoms are at war with the Latin state. And Innocent III excommunicates the Crusades' leaders, but he was basically powerless to do much else. So this is what the area looks like under the Latin Empire. So you'll see the Latin Empire there, basically the territory around Constantinople. And then on the other side, in Anatolia, you have the Empire of Nicaea, which was ruled by actual Byzantines, people connected with the old Byzantine imperial administration. They run the Empire of Nicaea. Then you also have the Empire of Trebizond. And then you have various duchies down there, the Duchy of the Archipelago, the Principality of Achaia, the Kingdom of Thessalonica. These are all pieces of the old empire that have fractured into their own states that claim that they are the true Byzantine state. And so this really does a number on them. If the Seljuk Turks had been more powerful at the time, who knows what they could have done with this sort of fractiousness. But of course, they're starting to kind of fall apart, and they'll be overtaken by the Ottoman Turks later on. But that's not the point of this lecture. So anyway, that's the Fourth Crusade. Some Crusaders do eventually get to the Holy Land, but it's not a lot, and it's not really worth talking about because they don't really achieve anything besides killing off the greatest city of the Western world at the time. So the Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, it's declared by Pope Honorius, who's the successor of Innocent III, and it's led by King Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria. And the Crusaders are going to target Jerusalem, and they do this by allying with the Seljuk Turks against the Ayyubids, which is the dynasty that controls Saladin's empire. Saladin is an Ayyubid, and so these guys are going to they're going to ally with the Seljuk Turks in the north, and then they are going to go down to Egypt and attack the Ayyubids in Egypt. And they're going to attack from both sides, and they're going to compress these guys so they have to fight a war on two fronts. It doesn't really go all that well. The Crusaders managed to capture the city of Damietta in Egypt, and they begin marching to Cairo, but they were stopped by supply issues, and they had to turn back. And there was the ruler of Egypt broke a dam along the Nile, which flooded the land around the Crusaders, and they were basically stuck and surrounded, and many starved and were killed in this trapped state that they were in. And the remainder of the Crusaders were forced to leave Egypt and agree to peace terms. So that's the Fifth Crusade. The Sixth Crusade, 1229 to 1244. That's a long time. It's really... It's like the 100 Years' War. They did all of that. The historians estimate that in the 100 Years' War, if you took all the fighting that occurred, it probably compresses down to 2 to 3 weeks, somewhere in there. So Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, he agrees to go on crusade after being crowned by Honorius III, and he marries the daughter of the King of Jerusalem to give himself a claim to the actual city and the kingdom. And the Pope and Frederick don't like each other, surprise, surprise, because the Emperor is also the King of Sicily, and Sicily controls the southern part of Italy and the island of Sicily, and as Emperor of Germany, he controls the northern part of Italy, which means that the Pope is surrounded by Frederick and his realms. And so the Pope does not trust Frederick, and the Frederick does not much like the Pope. Frederick's a bit of a Renaissance man. You might even call him a bit of a hippie. He doesn't really give into this whole religion thing. He kind of pays lip service to it, but he's more of a kind of a Renaissance man before the Renaissance. He's interested in poetry and music and languages and all this kind of stuff. He's not really interested in religion to any great extent, but nonetheless, he understands good PR. So Frederick, he goes out and he attempts to crusade, but then he falls ill and he turns back. And the Pope accuses him of breaking his vow. You have broken your vow. You have turned back from crusading. And he excommunicates Frederick. Then Frederick goes to Cyprus, ignoring the Pope, basically, don't care about the excommunication. He goes to Cyprus, and he says, look, because, I am married to Isabella, who is the daughter of the King of Jerusalem, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem technically has sovereignty in Cyprus, I am the overlord of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and I am the overlord, therefore, of Cyprus. And so he goes there, and he gets into a fight with local barons. And he later comes to an agreement with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil, and the agreement is essentially this, that Jerusalem would be given to Frederick along with coastal territory to support the city. He also gets back Jaffa, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, and certain other towns. The Muslims keep control of the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they would also keep castles in the Transjordan region. And it included a 10-year truce. So Frederick essentially buys Jerusalem. That's what happens here. He settles a deal with the Sultan to take control of Jerusalem. The Sultan is involved in a siege against Damascus. He's not interested in Jerusalem's a non-entity for him right now. It's not that important a city. Strategically, it's not important a city. If you look at Jerusalem, it's not. Its location, its siting, it's not really all that strategic a city. If it didn't have religious significance, it might be it might be sort of a backwater. But because of its significance religiously and historically, it's a major point. But strategically, it's not important for the Sultan, and so he essentially sells it to Frederick. And Frederick has the ability to go back to Europe and say, "I got back Jerusalem and all that stuff," and I did it without fighting. I was the most successful of all the Crusades. So that's basically the Sixth Crusade. So this is what the Crusader states look like at the end of Frederick's crusade. So you have the Principality of Antioch in the north, Cyprus, and then you have the County of Tripoli and the Kingdom of Jerusalem along the coast. Jerusalem will never be the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after this. The capital of the kingdom is in Acre, which is a well-fortified city. But this is essentially what it looks like when Frederick leaves. And this will be the terminal state of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. This is like the sort of take one last good look at this because this ain't lasting much longer. And in 1291, the last of the Crusader holdings, Acre, falls to the Muslims, and the Crusaders are booted out of the Holy Land permanently. They have no holdings left, and most of them go off to Cyprus or to Rhodes or back to Europe. So how do we assess the Crusades? Well, the Crusades initially start off as an act of martial piety, this combining of military and spiritual, and putting them together and trying to somehow, that the spiritual will sanctify the military, the violent nature of these Crusades. And in doing so, you can do a work for God that will please him and that will expand the church, the power and the influence of the church. It's an attempt to restore the physical kingdom of God on earth with a physical capital of that kingdom, which is Jerusalem. But of course we know, us being good Protestants, we know that the kingdom of God is a spiritual kingdom. It is not a physical kingdom. And any attempts to restore the physical kingdom, or a physical church, godly kingdom on earth, has generally failed. And the Crusade was originally intended to provide protection for defenseless pilgrims against hostile peoples and kingdoms in the Holy Land. It had a good motive. It was to protect people from injustice, you could say. But it quickly morphed into a commercial and a political activity. Christians and Christian kingdoms established trading relationships in the Holy Land very, very quickly. Many Europeans saw the Crusades as an opportunity for adventure and enrichment, as well as an act of piety. Remember, many landless noblemen go on the First Crusade with the intent of getting land in the Holy Land. It's a very rich area agriculturally and trade-wise, and so they can become very wealthy, whereas in Europe, generally not. And it's about kind of extending the church's influence into areas where they had been excluded previously. The Christians of the Holy Land are generally Greek Orthodox. They're not Catholic, although there's some Catholics. Generally, they're Greek Orthodox, outside of the authority of the Pope in Rome and outside of the authority of the Western Church. So the Crusade, the Church uses the Crusades as a way of sort of reimposing itself or its authority in the area. They also demonstrated that a mutual faith does not necessarily overcome national and ethnic differences among participating nations. And I think that that's a good point to understand, that we tend to think of ourselves, Christians, we're all brothers, but are we all brothers really? Like it's uh, when it suits us, we are. When it suits us, it's not. So it kind of points to the weakness of humanity in that our identities in Christ and in the church can be co-opted by our sinful natures. Isn't that the truth? Isn't that one of the main lessons of the New Testament, is that we battle against this flesh which is inherently sinful. And it's the spirit battling against the flesh, and the flesh can so often attempt to co-opt, or can co-opt, the spirit and make a mess of things. And so um, national and ethnic differences, we tend to think of the medieval world as a very pious religious place, and indeed it was, at least on the outside. But on the inside, the national differences and the ethnic differences mattered a lot. People did not put those aside for the sake of the church and for the sake of unity. So it's just something to think about that way. It emphasized, if you will, the national differences, and it kind of emphasized the fact that when Europe wanted to, it could come together and agree. But its default position is to break into national groups, and to kind of be in conflict with each other, which is something that the European Union now in the modern era is kind of a bulwark against, or it puts itself against this sort of European inter-European tribal warfare. And it's really fighting against the lessons of history, that these nations can put aside national interests and differences for the greater good. And we'll see if that ends up working. So far, they've managed to do it, but with Britain leaving, we'll see. But anyway, I think it also shows the folly of attempting to spread Christianity by the sword. Despite existing for just under 200 years, the Crusader states seem to have failed evangelistically. They didn't really convert a lot of Greek Orthodox Christians to Catholicism. They didn't convert really any Muslims to Christianity. There was not a greater presence of Christians in the Middle East at the time the Crusader states fell apart than when they came. The Greek Orthodox community kept to itself. The Muslims kind of kept to themselves, and the Latin Christians kind of kept to themselves. The missionary work of the church was really lost in the Crusade, and the evangelism was not there. So the early evangelism that you see when the church sends missionaries to places like Ireland or Northern Europe to convert people, or to England to convert people, that's not seen in the Crusades. That doesn't happen in the Crusades. That evangelistic part of it is really, really lost. So anyway, that is my brief assessment of the Crusading era, and that will bring us to the close of the Crusading era. And I think next week what we will do is we will talk about Pope Innocent III. We'll talk about him a bit, and then we'll get into the Inquisition, and we'll get into theology. And then after theology, I think we will move into preparing for the Reformation. So any questions about the Crusades, the Crusading era, this time frame?
You had mentioned that the English and French were at war with each other right at the beginning.
Yeah.
You know what that war was about?
Uh,
But they fought each other often.
they fought each other often. I don't know specifically what that particular conflict was about. Generally, it's about the French king attempting to extend his control and influence into the western parts of France, which are controlled by the English king. And generally, it's caused by the English king refusing to do obedience to the French king, because technically the French king in France is the English king's overlord. So for all the English king's lands in France, the French king is his overlord, and so under the feudal system, he's required to pay homage to the French king. And generally, the English kings don't do that, because they say, "Well, I'm a king. I am not paying homage to any other king. I don't have to do that." And so that generally sparks wars. It's kind of built in chivalric war. In chivalry, that's the excuse, but really it's because the king of France just simply wants to extend his lands. So that's generally what those things are about. The English will maintain a presence on the continent until the fall of Calais, which is in the reign of Mary the First, Bloody Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII. I cannot remember the year, but Calais was the last city under English control, and I believe it's King John, bad King John, who's so inept at being a war leader that he loses a great deal of English territory to the point where the only thing left is Calais. So at this point, the French are definitely gaining dominance over the English on the soil. So it's basically this is the sort of your standard warfare between the English and the French. The English maintained up until which king was it? Up until relatively recently, I think up until about the 1700s. Or no, maybe even up until Queen Victoria, they maintained the title of King of France. Like they claimed to be kings of France. They pretended to that title. So yeah, it's the rivalry between them is very historic and ongoing and all that stuff. But specifically, what they were fighting about at that time, I couldn't say. Yeah, no problem. All right, well, I think then we'll end it there. We're just a few minutes before the hour. So next week we'll look at Innocent the Third. I may cancel next week class. I'm not sure yet. I'll have to look, see what the material is. But in any case, we'll quickly move on through the Middle Ages and get to the Reformation.